The late afternoon sun, a common painter in the modest AEO apartments of a city more known for its quiet industry than its glamour, cast long shadows across Ilara's small living room. It was a tidy space, filled with the gentle clutter of a life lived with love but without excess. A worn but comfortable armchair, draped with a hand-knitted throw, sat beside a small bookshelf overflowing with well-read paperbacks and a collection of colorful children's picture books. On the windowsill, a small pot of herbs struggled valiantly for light. The air smelled faintly of lavender soap and the lingering aroma of the simple chicken soup Ilara had made for lunch. Her son, 4-year-old Leo, dark-haired and with eyes that held an uncanny resemblance to a memory Ilara cherished and mourned in equal measure, was absorbed in building a wobbly tower with a set of brightly colored wooden blocks. His small tongue poked out in concentration, a miniature echo of a mannerism that made Ilara's heart ache with a familiar pang of loss. The envelope had arrived that morning, thick and creamy, its embossed lettering a stark contrast to the usual collection of bills and circulars that constituted Ilara's mail. It lay on the small, scarred pine table that served as their dining area, an alien artifact from a world she had once brushed against but never truly belonged to. A world that had been Alistair's. Alistair, even now, a full year after the sudden, senseless accident that had snatched him from her and their son. His name was a whisper in her soul, a source of both profound love and an enduring sorrow. The invitation was for the wedding of Daniel Ainsworth, Alistair's younger, more carefree brother, to a Victoria Beaumont. The Beaumonts, Ilara knew from Alistair's occasional, reluctant mentions, were a family of considerable social standing and even more considerable self-regard. The wedding, the invitation proclaimed in elegant script, was to be held at the Beaumont family's country estate, an affair undoubtedly destined for the society pages. Ilara picked it up, her fingers tracing the raised lettering. A part of her wanted to toss it straight into the bin. What place did she, a struggling single mother living on a meager income from part-time freelance proofreading, have at such an event? She pictured the guests, women in designer gowns, men in bespoke suits, their conversations a light, dismissive murmur about stocks, shares, and summer holidays in the south of France. She, in her best dress, a simple Navy A-line she had owned for 5 years, would be an anomaly, a smudge on their perfect, polished canvas. And then there was the matter of a gift. The unspoken expectation at such weddings was for offerings of silver, crystal, or checks with an impressive number of zeros. Ilara's current bank balance, after paying rent and utilities, hovered precariously in the low double digits. The thought of buying a gift, any gift, that wouldn't look pitifully inadequate was laughable. Yet, the invitation lay there, a heavy summons. It wasn't Daniel she felt an obligation to, though Alistair had always spoken of his younger brother with a kind of exasperated affection. It was Alistair himself. Her mind drifted back, as it so often did, to a conversation they'd had on a rainy Sunday afternoon, curled up together in Alistair's surprisingly unpretentious city, its apartment, a haven filled with books, music, and the comfortable chaos of a man who valued ideas over appearances. Leo, then just a babe in arms, had been asleep in his cot in the corner. "He's a good lad, Daniel," Alistair had said, stroking her hair as they watched the rain lash against the window. A bit lost sometimes, easily swayed by the louder voices in the room, but his heart's in the right place. I worry about him, you know. Dad always, well, Dad had his favorites, and Daniel often felt overshadowed. Donovan Ainsworth, Alistair and Daniel's father, had been a formidable figure, a titan of industry who had built an empire and expected his sons to follow in his footsteps with unquestioning loyalty. Alistair, with his quiet brilliance and independent spirit, had managed to carve his own path, respected but never entirely understood by his father. Daniel, more eager to please, had often struggled. "I want Leo to know him. Ilara," Alistair had continued, his voice soft but earnest. When the time is right, when I've navigated the family waters a bit more smoothly. I want Daniel to be an uncle to our son, a real uncle, someone Leo can look up to, laugh with. Promise me, whatever happens, you'll try to make that connection for him, for Leo, and for Daniel too. I suppose. He needs good people in his life. Alara had promised, of course, her heart swelling with love for this thoughtful, complex man who had brought such unexpected joy into her quiet life. They had met at a university extension course she was taking in art history, where Alistair, under an assumed name and supposedly researching a book, had been a fellow student. He had been drawn to her quiet intelligence, her gentle humor, her complete lack of artifice. She, in turn, had been captivated by his keen mind, his unexpected kindness, and the sadness that sometimes flickered in his otherwise warm eyes. Their relationship had blossomed in secret. Alistair had been adamant about it. My family, they live in a different world. Alara, he'd explained, a shadow crossing his face. They have certain expectations, prejudices, if I'm honest. I don't want to expose you, or Leo, to that until I'm sure I can protect you from it, until I can make them understand. He had spoken of a domineering mother, now deceased, and a father who, while not unkind, was a product of his rigid, class-conscious upbringing. Alistair himself had eschewed much of the family's ostentatious wealth, preferring a simpler, more private existence, though he managed his considerable inheritance with a quiet astuteness that benefited many charitable causes. Alara had understood, or at least, she had tried. She had loved Alistair for who he was, not for his family name or his hidden fortune, details of which he had only gradually and reluctantly revealed. Their world had been small, but it had been rich with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of raising their son. Then, the accident. A reckless driver, a rain-slicked road, and Alistair was gone. The world had tilted on its axis. The discreet support he had provided for her and Leo had vanished with him, as his official estate, managed by lawyers she didn't know, and a family who didn't know she existed, was settled. She had been left with her grief, her son, and the modest savings she had always insisted on maintaining from her own work. Now, this invitation, a chance to fulfill that promise to Alistair, however painful, however awkward. Leo stirred, his block tower finally toppling with a soft clatter. He looked up at her, his Alistair eyes wide. "Uh-oh, Mama, all fall down." Alara smiled, the familiar ache in her chest easing Xiaoxi at the sight of him. "That's okay, my love. We can build it up again." She knelt beside him, helping him gather the blocks. As they rebuilt the tower, her decision solidified. She would go. Not for herself. Certainly not for the Beaumonts or even for Daniel, whom she barely knew. She would go for Alistair, and for Leo. It was the last promise she could keep for the man she loved. The days leading up to the wedding were a quiet torment of practicalities. Her wardrobe yielded nothing suitable. Her one good dress, the navy A-line, felt hopelessly inadequate for a society wedding. After much agonizing, she found a simple, long-sleeved, dusty rose dress on a sale rack in a department store. Its fabric modest, but its cut elegant enough. She hoped, not to scream charity case. It cost more than she could truly afford, meaning a week of even tighter budgeting, but she justified it as a necessity. The gift was a bigger problem. She considered a small, handmade item, a knitted baby blanket for a future Ainsworth cousin, perhaps, or a framed print of one of her own delicate botanical drawings. But she imagined it sitting forlornly amongst the silver candelabras and designer homewares, an object of pity or, worse, scorn. In the end, she decided against it. Her presence, her quiet honoring of Alistair's wish, would have to be gift enough. If they judged her for it, then so be it. Their judgment could not touch the truth of her love for Alistair, or his for her and their son. On the Saturday of the wedding, Alara dressed herself and Leo with meticulous care. Leo, scrubbed meblag and shining in a small, neatly pressed shirt and trousers she had found at a charity shop, looked like a little prince, his father's aristocratic bone structure already evident in his small, serious face. Alara herself, in the dusty rose dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon, looked pale but composed. A locket Alistair had given her, a small, antique silver piece with a tiny, almost invisible sapphire, rested beneath her dress, a secret comfort against her skin. As they set off on the series of buses that would eventually take them to the outskirts of the city, and then, hopefully, a taxi for the final leg to the Beaumont estate, Alara clutched her worn handbag. Inside, there was no expensive gift, only a heart full of trepidation, a memory of a promise, and an unshakable love for the man whose legacy she carried, both in her heart and in the small hand and Quan now clutching hers. She was walking into the lion's den, a lamb armed only with her quiet dignity. What awaited her, she did not know, but for Alistair, and for Leo, she would face it. The taxi, a battered vehicle that smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and pine-scented air freshener, finally deposited Alara and Leo at the imposing wrought-iron gates of the Beaumont estate. Even from this distance, the sheer scale of the property was daunting. A long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees and meticulously manicured lawns, led to a sprawling, ivy-covered manor house that looked as though it had been plucked from the pages of a classic English novel. Rolls-Royces and Bentleys were already parked in neat, gleaming rows on the graveled expanse before the entrance, their presence a silent testament to the wealth and status of the assembled guests. Alara paid the driver with a significant portion of her remaining cash, a knot fatters in her stomach. Leo, his small hand clutching hers tightly, gazed wide-eyed at the scene. "Wow, Mama," he whispered. "Is this a castle?" "Something like that, my love," Alara murmured, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. She smoothed down her dusty rose dress, suddenly acutely aware of its simple fabric and sail-rack origins. The silver locket Alistair had given her felt cool against her skin, a small, secret anchor in a sea of impending social anxiety. As they walked towards the entrance, where a liveried footman was greeting arrivals, Alara felt the first wave of appraising glances. Women in jewel-toned silk dresses and gravity-defying hats paused in their conversations to cast discreet, then not so discreet, looks in her direction. Their eyes flickered over her dress, her sensible low-heeled shoes, the absence of any ostentatious jewelry, and then lingered on young Leo, a child whose presence at such a formal adult affair was perhaps another mark against her. The marquee for the reception had been erected on a vast lawn behind the house, a confection of white silk and crystal chandeliers. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and even more expensive flowers. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and delicate canapes. The murmur of polite, privileged conversation filled the space. Alara felt a desperate urge to turn and flee, to snatch Leo up and run back to the comforting anonymity of her small AT apartment. But Alistair's face, his earnest plea, echoed in her mind. "Promise me. Alara. Let Daniel know his nephew." She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and forced a small, polite smile onto her face. For Leo. For Alistair. She tried to find a quiet corner, a place where she and Leo could be relatively inconspicuous. It was an almost impossible task in a space designed for display. Every glance felt like a judgment. Every hushed laugh seemed directed at her. She held Leo's hand a little tighter, a protective gesture. He, at least, seemed unfazed by the social undercurrents. His attention captured by a magnificent ice sculpture of two swans in the center of a buffet table, laden with an improbable array of delicacies. It was then that she saw her, Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont, mother of the bride. A woman whose photograph Alara had once seen in a society magazine Alistair had inadvertently left at her AI apartment. In person, she was even more formidable. Tall and slender, her silver hair coiffed into an regal helmet. She wore a gown of deep sapphire blue that shimmered with every movement. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, cold and hard like her eyes. She was a grande dame in every sense of the word, surveying her domain with an air of absolute authority. Mrs. Beaumont's gaze swept across the room, assessing, cataloging. It paused for a fraction of a second too long on Alara and Leo. Alara saw a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, before the older woman's expression settled back into one of polite, icy composure. Then, with the stately progress of a galleon, Mrs. Beaumont began to move in their direction, a pathfinder through the sea of guests. Alara's heart sank. She had hoped to avoid any direct confrontation, at least until she had a chance to speak quietly with Daniel, if such an opportunity ever arose. "And you are Mrs." Beaumont's voice was a low, cultured drawl, but it carried an unmistakable edge of condescension. She addressed Alara, though her eyes flickered dismissively over Leo. "Alara Vance, Mrs. Beaumont," Alara replied, her voice a little breathless. "I was a friend of Alistair Ainsworth." She offered her hand, but Mrs. Beaumont merely looked at it for a moment before her gaze returned to Alara's face, a faint, disdainful smile on her lips. "Alistair." Mrs. Beaumont raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Ah, yes, my son-in-law Daniel's late brother. A tragedy, of course. Alistair had many acquaintances, from all walks of life." The implication was clear. Alara was from one of the less desirable walks. "He was a very dear friend," Alara said quietly. A protective warmth wardened Alistair's memory. Mrs. Beaumont's eyes traveled pointedly down Alara's simple dress, then to the absence of any discernible gift in her hands, or at the nearby groaning gift table. "Indeed. And how kind of you to make the effort to attend. Miss Vance, I trust the journey wasn't too inconvenient for you and your son." The pause before son was laden with unspoken questions. "Not at all," Alara said, forcing herself to meet the older woman's gaze. "Leo and I were very happy to be invited." She placed a hand gently on Leo's shoulder. Leo, sensing the tension despite not understanding the words, pressed closer to her leg. "Yes, well," Mrs. Beaumont said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Daniel has such a kind heart. Always has. Do try to enjoy yourselves. The champagne is excellent, I believe, though perhaps not for everyone." Another pointed glance at Alara's still slender but unmistakably pregnant figure. A pregnancy that had been well advanced even before Alistair's death, and was thus clearly not Alistair's doing in this new narrative. Though the child Leo was, Alara chose to ignore the insinuation, if that was what it was, or simply the general disapproval. The truth was, the pregnancy she was currently experiencing was not Alistair's, but Leo. Her son by her side was. The current pregnancy was from a brief, ill-advised relationship after Alistair's death. A complication she hadn't planned, but was now a reality she had to face. And it only made her appear more of an outcast in Mrs. Beaumont's eyes. With a curt nod, Mrs. Beaumont swept away, leaving Alara feeling as though she had been inspected, weighed, and found wanting. The encounter, though brief, had set the tone. She was an outsider, an unwelcome guest, tolerated only because of Daniel's misplaced kindness. Or so Mrs. Beaumont clearly believed. As the afternoon wore on, Alara tried to make herself and Leo invisible. They found a small bench in a quieter part of the vast gardens, near a rose arbor that reminded Alara breakingly of Alistair, who had loved roses. Leo, blessedly, was content to chase butterflies and collect fallen petals, his innocent joy a stark contrast to Alara's inner turmoil. She saw the bride and groom from a distance. Victoria Beaumont was a vision in white, a perfect society princess, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes. Daniel, handsome in his morning suit, looked happy but also slightly overwhelmed, constantly at Victoria's side, or being guided by Mrs. Beaumont. Once, his eyes met Alara's across the lawn. She saw a flicker of recognition, a brief, hesitant smile, before Victoria claimed his attention again, and he turned away. There was no warm welcome, no special acknowledgement. Alistair's hope that Daniel would be a kind uncle to Leo felt, in that moment, like a distant, naive dream. Alara overheard snippets of conversation from passing guests, their voices carrying on the breeze. "Did you see that woman with the child terribly out of place? Don't you think—" "No gift, I heard. Some people just have no sense of propriety." Probably some charity case Daniel felt sorry for. His brother Alistair was always picking up strays. Each whispered word was a small dart, piercing Alara's carefully constructed composure. She drew Leo closer, stroking his dark hair, so like Alistair's. She was here for him, she reminded herself. She was here to keep a promise. But the weight of their judgment, the oppressive atmosphere of disapproval, was almost unbearable. She wondered, not for the first time, if she had made a mistake. Perhaps Alistair, in his love for her and his son, had underestimated the true depth of his family's snobbery, or the ruthlessness of a world that measured worth in carats and bank balances. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, cool shadows across the manicured lawns, the guests began to move towards the marquee for the formal dinner and speeches. Alara knew, with a sinking heart, that the ordeal was far from over. The gift table, or rather, her glaring absence from it, would soon become an even more public spectacle. She braced herself, clinging to the image of Alistair's loving eyes, and the small, warm hand of his son, nestled trustingly in hers. This weight of judgment was heavy, but the weight of her promise, and her love, was heavier still. The afternoon sun mellowed, its golden rays slanting through the opulent marquee, illuminating dancing dust motes and the glitter of jewels. The initial flurry of arrivals had subsided, and the wedding reception was now settling into a rhythm of polite conversation, clinking champagne flutes, and the occasional burst of orchestrated laughter. Alara had managed to find a relatively inconspicuous chair near a large floral arrangement, partially shielding her and Leo from the main thoroughfare of guests. Leo, tired from the earlier excitement in the gardens, was leaning drowsily against her, his small fingers still clutching a handful of crushed rose petals. Alara watched as a procession of guests, bearing brightly wrapped packages and expensive-looking gift bags, made their way towards a large, linen-draped table near the entrance of the marquee. The table was already groaning under the weight of silver picture frames, crystal vases, designer kitchen appliances, and a collection of creamy envelopes that undoubtedly contained substantial checks. It was a public display of wealth and an affirmation of the Beaumont Ainsworth's social standing. Each offering was received with beaming smiles from the bride and groom, Victoria and Daniel, and a gracious, if somewhat proprietary, nod from Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont, who stood radom, a queen overseeing her tribute. Alara felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She had nothing to add to that gleaming pile. Her only offering was her presence, a quiet fulfillment of a promise to a man long gone. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that this would not go unnoticed. Not in this company. As if summoned by her thoughts, Mrs. Beaumont, having momentarily detached herself from the gift-receiving line, began a slow, deliberate promenade through the assembled guests, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk spotting its prey. Her gaze eventually settled on Alara and the sleeping Leo. There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause, and then, with a subtle shift in her direction, Mrs. Beaumont began to advance towards them. Victoria, the bride, momentarily disengaged from a fawning admirer, noticed her mother's trajectory and, with a whispered word to Daniel, followed a few paces behind, a smirk playing on her perfectly glossed lips. Alara's breath caught. She gently tried to rouse Leo, hoping they could somehow melt into the background. But it was too late. Mrs. Beaumont stood before them, an imposing figure in her sapphire gown, her diamond necklace glinting coldly. "Miss Vance," Mrs. Beaumont began, her voice deceptively sweet, yet carrying an undertone that made the nearby conversations falter. Several heads turned in their direction. "How very persistent of you to remain. I was just admiring the truly remarkable generosity of our guests. Such exquisite gifts, a testament, I believe, to the affection in which Victoria and Daniel are held." She paused, her eyes flicking pointedly towards Alara's empty hands, then to the space beside her chair, equally devoid of any offering. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of seeing your contribution to the happy couple's new life, Miss Vance. Or perhaps it was so modest it escaped my notice." The blood rushed to Alara's face. The public nature of the address, the carefully chosen words designed to embarrass, made her stomach churn. Leo, now awake, looked from his mother's distressed face to the towering, silver-haired woman before them, his lower lip beginning to tremble. "Mrs. Beaumont," Alara began, her voice low and strained, "I came today to offer my sincere congratulations to Daniel and Victoria, and to honor a personal connection." A personal connection. Mrs. Beaumont's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. How very touching. And does this personal connection preclude the customary gesture of a wedding gift, or are we to assume that your presence is the gift itself? Her voice dripped sarcasm, and a few of the nearby guests tittered. Victoria, a younger, sharper version of her mother, stepped forward. "Really, Mother," she said, with a tinkling laugh that didn't quite mask the malice. "Perhaps Miss Vance operates under a different set of social understandings. Not everyone can appreciate the finer points of etiquette. Can they?" Alara felt Leo's small hand grip hers tightly. His eyes were wide with a child's instinctive fear when sensing adult hostility. This was what she had dreaded, what she had tried so desperately to shield him from. "My circumstances do not currently allow for extravagant gifts, Mrs. Beaumont," Alara said, forcing herself to meet the older woman's gaze. Her own voice was quiet but steady, a small island of dignity in a rising tide of humiliation. "But my good wishes for Daniel and Victoria are entirely sincere." "Good wishes." Mrs. Beaumont scoffed, her voice now rising, ensuring a wider audience. "My dear Miss Vance, good wishes are all very well and good, but they hardly contribute to setting up a new household, do they? This is a Beaumont-Ainsworth wedding, not a charity drive for the less fortunate. One would expect a certain level of decorum, a certain understanding of what is appropriate when accepting an invitation to an event of this caliber." The words "less fortunate" hung in the air, a deliberate, targeted insult. Alara could feel the stares of the surrounding guests, some curious, some pitying, many openly contemptuous. She looked desperately towards Daniel, the groom, who stood near the head table, now clearly aware of the unfolding scene. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, his face flushed. He made a small, abortive movement, as if to step forward, but Victoria placed a restraining hand on his arm, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. Annoyance, Alara suspected, more at the unseemly public display than at the injustice being meted out. Daniel subsided, his gaze dropping to the floor. Alistair's words echoed in Alara's memory. "He's a good lad. Daniel, a bit lost sometimes, easily swayed by the louder voices." The accuracy of that assessment was a fresh stab of pain. "Mrs. Beaumont," emboldened by Daniel's inaction and Alara's quiet distress, pressed her advantage. "Frankly, Miss Vance, your appearance here, empty-handed, dressed in, well, dressed as you are, it's rather an impertinence. Don't you think an insult to the bride and groom, and to all of us who have made an effort to celebrate this joyous occasion appropriately?" Leo began to cry, soft, frightened sobs he tried to muffle against Alara's side. That was the breaking point. The carefully constructed dam of Alara's composure, already strained to its limits, finally gave way, not in a torrent of anger, but in a surge of fierce, protective love for her child. She would not allow her son, Alistair's son, to witness her complete degradation, nor to be tainted by this venomous snobbery. She knelt, ignoring Mrs. Beaumont, ignoring the circle of staring faces, and gently wiped Leo's tears. "It's all right, my darling," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's all right. We don't have to stay where people are unkind." She stood up, her small stature suddenly imbued with a quiet, steely strength. She looked directly at Mrs. Beaumont, not with anger, but with a profound, sorrowful dignity that seemed to momentarily disconcert the older woman. "You are quite right, Mrs. Beaumont," Alara said, her voice clear and carrying, though not raised. "Perhaps an event like this is out of my depth, or perhaps," she added, her gaze sweeping briefly over the opulent surroundings and the smug faces, "it is simply out of my desire to be in a place where kindness and basic human decency are valued less than the price tag on a gift." Without another word, she took Leo's hand. The whispers intensified as she began to walk away, not towards the exit, but towards a slightly more secluded path that led deeper into the gardens, away from the suffocating judgment of the Marquis. She needed a moment to breathe, to comfort her son, to gather her thoughts before deciding her next move. The humiliation was a raw, burning wound. Mrs. Beaumont's words, Victoria's sneer, Daniel's spinelessness, they all swirled in her mind. But stronger than the shame was a growing resolve. Alistair had believed in the good in his brother, had wanted his son to know his family. But he would never have wanted this. He would never have wanted his child, or the woman he loved, to be subjected to such cruelty. As Alara disappeared from view behind a hedge of roses, Mrs. Beaumont let out a triumphant little scoff. "Well, some people simply have no breeding whatsoever," she announced to her captivated audience, preening slightly. But a few guests, those with a little more perception, a little more heart, looked uneasy. There had been something in the quiet dignity of the young woman, something in the fierce protectiveness she showed her child, that didn't quite fit the picture of a mere freeloader. The air in the Marquis, despite the champagne and the forced gaiety, suddenly felt a little colder, a little more hollow. The weight of judgment had been dispensed, but a different, unacknowledged weight now seemed to settle in its place. Alara found a secluded stone bench tucked away behind a fragrant wall of climbing roses, their perfume a poignant reminder of Alistair's favorite blooms. Leo, sensing his mother's distress, had finally succumbed to tears, his small body trembling against hers. She held him close, murmuring reassurances, stroking his dark, silky hair, so like his father's. The raw humiliation of Mrs. Beaumont's attack washed over her in waves, leaving her feeling bruised and exposed. For a moment, the urge to simply flee, to disappear from this gilded cage of judgment and scorn, was overwhelming. But as Leo's sobs gradually subsided into hiccuping breaths, a different emotion began to stir within Alara. It was a slow burn, starting deep in her belly, a protective fire ignited by the sight of her son's innocent pain. Alistair had been a man of immense integrity, of quiet strength and profound kindness. He had abhorred cruelty and artifice. He would have been appalled by the scene that had just transpired, by the casual brutality with which she, and by extension their son, had been treated. He had wanted Leo to know his family, to have a connection with Daniel, but not like this, not at the cost of their dignity. The promise she had made to him was not a license for others to trample upon her or their child. A new resolve began to harden within her. She had come to this wedding out of love and duty to Alistair's memory. She had endured the sidelong glances, the whispered judgments, the thinly veiled contempt. But Mrs. Beaumont had crossed a line. She had attacked not just Alara, but the very idea that someone like her, someone without wealth or status, could have anything of value to offer. And in doing so, she had inadvertently insulted the memory of Alistair himself, who had loved Alara precisely for who she was, not for what she possessed. "It's okay, my sweet boy," she whispered to Leo, kissing the top of his head. "Mama's here, and Mama is not going to let anyone make you feel small. Not ever." She stood up, taking Leo's hand. There was a new light in her eyes, a calm, steady fire that had replaced the earlier fear and uncertainty. She would not slink away in shame. She owed it to Alistair, to Leo, and to herself, to speak her truth, not for their acceptance, not for their approval, but because some things needed to be said, some lines needed to be drawn. With Leo's small hand held in hers, Alara walked back towards the marquee. She didn't re-enter the main throng, but stood at the edge of the terrace, where the garden met the open sides of the tent. From there, she could see and be seen. Mrs. Beaumont was once again holding court, recounting, no doubt with embellishments, the story of the impertinent woman she had so effectively put in her place. Laughter, a little too loud, a little too sharp, rippled from her appreciative audience. Alara waited for a fractional pause in the older woman's monologue. Then, she spoke. Her voice was not raised, yet it seemed to cut through the chatter and the clinking glasses with an unexpected clarity and authority. "Mrs. Beaumont." Heads turned. Conversations died. Mrs. Beaumont herself, interrupted mid-anecdote, looked towards Alara with an expression of astonished irritation, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly presumed to address her. Victoria, standing beside her mother, mirrored her affronted surprise. "I believe you and I have some unfinished business," Alara continued, her gaze steady, meeting Mrs. Beaumont's icy stare without flinching. Leo, sensing the shift in his mother's demeanor, stood quietly beside her, his earlier fear replaced by a child's solemn curiosity. "Unfinished business," Mrs. Beaumont's voice was dangerously soft. "My dear Miss Vance, I thought our transaction was quite concluded. Unless you've suddenly remembered a misplaced diamond tiara you intended to bestow upon the happy couple." Another ripple of sycophantic laughter, quickly stifled as Alara remained unmoved. "My reasons for being here today, Mrs. Beaumont," Alara said, her voice gaining strength, "are not for your amusement, nor are they for your judgment. I came, as I mentioned, to honor a promise made to a man whom you, I believe, once held in some regard, a man whom you, Mr. Ainsworth." She now addressed Daniel directly, her gaze finding him where he stood, looking deeply uncomfortable beside his new bride. "Called your brother." Daniel flinched as if struck. Victoria's hand tightened on his arm. The attention of every guest within earshot was now riveted on this quiet, plainly dressed young woman who dared to challenge the matriarch of the Beaumont clan. "You have made it abundantly clear, Mrs. Beaumont," Alara went on, her voice ringing with a conviction that belied her simple attire, "that you believe I have nothing of value, that I bring nothing to this celebration, that my presence here, empty-handed, is an insult." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The silence in the marquee was now absolute, heavy with anticipation. "You are concerned, perhaps, that I seek something from your family, that I am, as you so delicately implied, a freeloader, a stray." Alistair picked up. Her eyes met Mrs. Beaumont's, and for the first time, it was the older woman who seemed to waver, a flicker of unease in her cold eyes. Ilara then bent down slightly, her hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder. She looked at her son, her expression softening with an immeasurable love, before straightening to face the stunned assembly once more. "The truth, Mrs. Beaumont. The truth. Everyone." Her voice resonated, clear and unwavering, "is that I did not come to this wedding empty-handed. I brought with me the most precious gift of all, a gift that connects me, irrevocably, to the Ainsworth family, and to the memory of the man whose kindness and integrity you all claim to celebrate today." She drew Leo a half-step forward, her hand still protectively on his shoulder. The child, sensing the gravity of the moment, looked out at the sea of faces with a solemnity that mirrored his father's. "This is my son," Ilara declared, her voice now imbued with a strength that seemed to fill the vast marquee. "His name is Leo Alistair Vance." She paused, letting the name hang in the air. Then, looking directly into the horrified, disbelieving eyes of Eleanor Beaumont, she delivered the final, devastating truth. "And he is Alistair Ainsworth's son." The words, spoken without malice but with an undeniable, earth-shattering power, fell into a silence so profound it seemed as if the world itself had stopped breathing. Champagne flutes remained suspended halfway to lips. Forkfuls of cake lay untouched on porcelain plates. Every eye was fixed on Ilara and the small, dark-haired boy standing beside her. Mrs. Beaumont's perfectly made-up face seemed to crumble. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. The sapphire blue of her gown seemed to drain the color from her skin, leaving her looking suddenly old and fragile. Victoria, beside her, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her own throat, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning, horrified comprehension. Daniel Ainsworth, the groom, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. He stared at Leo, truly seeing him for the first time, his face a mask of disbelief, confusion, and a sudden, terrible understanding. He took an involuntary step backwards, away from his bride, away from her family. His gaze locked on the child who bore his late brother's name, and, now that he truly looked, his unmistakable features. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the shattering of carefully constructed illusions. Alistair Ainsworth, the respected, wealthy, enigmatic elder son, a man whose integrity was legendary, whose early death had been mourned by all present, had a son. And this quiet, unassuming woman, this nobody they had scorned and humiliated, was the mother of his child. The unveiling was complete. Ilara stood her ground, her hand a firm, reassuring presence on Leo's shoulder, meeting the astonished, disbelieving, or suddenly calculating gazes of the wedding guests. The power in the opulent marquis had just undergone a seismic, irreversible shift. The silence that followed Ilara's declaration was a living entity, a palpable vacuum that sucked the air from the opulent marquis. Champagne flutes froze midway to lips. Polite smiles stiffened and died, and the light-hearted music from the string quartet faltered, then ceased altogether as even the musicians sensed the seismic shift in the atmosphere. Every eye was fixed on Ilara and the small boy who stood, bewildered but resolute, beside her. Leo, Alistair Ainsworth's son. The words echoed in the sudden, profound stillness. It was Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont who broke the spell. Her gasp a ragged, tearing sound. The blood drained from her face, leaving her powdered skin a ghastly white beneath the carefully coiffed silver hair. For a moment, she seemed to sway, her hand clutching the back of a nearby chair for support. Her eyes, moments before glinting with malicious triumph, were now wide with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, unutterable horror. What did you say she finally managed?" Her voice a hoarse whisper, all its earlier cultured condescension stripped away. Before Ilara could respond, a wave of murmurs, then louder whispers, erupted throughout the assembled guests. The shockwave of Ilara's words spread outwards, a tremor that shook the foundations of this carefully orchestrated display of social superiority. Alistair's son. Did she say Alistair impossible? He was never married, never mentioned a child. Look at the boy. Do you see a resemblance? Mrs. Beaumont seemed to draw a ragged breath, and with it a resurgence of her formidable, if now somewhat frayed, arrogance. Her face, still pale, began to mottle with an angry red. Lies, she shrieked, her voice cracking. This is an outrage, a preposterous, contemptible lie. How dare you come here and spew such filth? You shameless opportunist. She took a menacing step towards Alara, her diamonds flashing. You think you can tarnish the memory of a good man, a respected man, with your disgusting fabrications. You think you can extort this family. Alara stood her ground, her arm protectively around Leo, who had buried his face in her side. I have no intention of tarnishing Alistair's memory. Mrs. Beaumont, she said, her voice quiet but firm, managing to carry above the rising tide of excited whispers. I loved him deeply, and he loved our son. I am here today because Alistair wished it, because he wanted Leo to know his father's family. His father's family does not include scheming little tramps who appear out of nowhere with fabricated children. Victoria, the bride, finally found her voice, her beautiful face contorted with a fury that mirrored her mother's. She rushed to her mother's side, glaring at Alara. Daniel, do something. Are you going to let this creature ruin our wedding day with her vile accusations? All eyes turned to Daniel Ainsworth, the groom. He stood frozen, his face ashen, his gaze flitting between Alara, young Leo, his furious new wife, and his equally furious mother-in-law. He looked like a man caught in a crossfire, utterly paralyzed. I don't, he stammered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, dislodging a few strands. This is a shock. Alistair never said anything. Of course, he never said anything. Darling, Victoria snapped, her voice shrill. Because it's not true. It's a pathetic attempt to get money. Isn't it? She spat at Alara. You probably heard about Alistair's wealth and thought you could cash in. The only thing I wish to claim, Miss Beaumont, Alara responded, her composure a stark contrast to the hysteria of the Beaumont women, is my son's rightful heritage, not of money, but of a name and the knowledge of his father. Alistair was a private man. He had his reasons for keeping our life together discreet, reasons that largely involved protecting us from the very kind of judgment and cruelty you are displaying now. The quiet conviction in Alara's voice gave some of the guests pause. Among the older attendees, those who had known Alistair well, a different kind of whispering began. Eyes that had earlier held disdain now scrutinized young Leo with a new intensity. The boy, peeking out from behind Alara's dress, had Alistair's dark, wavy hair, Alistair's thoughtful brow, and, most strikingly, Alistair's deep-set, serious gray eyes, eyes that were currently wide with fear but held an unmistakable echo of his father's quiet intelligence. By Jove! A portly gentleman with a cravat murmured to his wife, the boy does look like Alistair. Remarkably so. His wife nodded slowly, her lorgnette trained on Leo. The set of the jaw, too. And Alistair always had a soft spot for those less ostentatious. This isn't impossible, Gerald. Mrs. Beaumont heard these murmurs, saw the shifting expressions, and her panic seemed to intensify. Nonsense coincidence. This woman is a fraud. I tell you, she has coached the boy's security. Someone call security and have this pair removed from my property immediately. But the security guards, hired for the event, looked hesitant, unsure how to proceed in the face of such a high-stakes family drama. Their eyes flickered towards Daniel, the supposed man of the hour, but he offered no direction, still looking utterly poleaxed. It was then that an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Mr. Charles Harrison, an elderly, distinguished man known for his long and close business partnership with the late Donovan Ainsworth, Alistair and Daniel's father, and for his own impeccable reputation, stepped forward. He had been a silent observer until now, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "Eleanor," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, addressing Mrs. Beaumont, Victoria, Daniel. "Perhaps a little decorum is in order. We are at a wedding, not a public brawl." He turned his gaze to Alara, a gaze that was searching but not unkind. "Miss Vance, you have made a most serious claim. A claim that, if true, concerns not only the memory of Alistair Ainsworth, a man many of us held in the highest esteem, but also the future of his lineage." Mrs. Beaumont opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Harrison raised a hand. "Allow me, Eleanor, before anyone calls for security or makes further accusations, perhaps we should allow Miss Vance the opportunity to substantiate her claim, if she is able to do so. If this child is indeed Alistair's son, then he is a member of the Ainsworth family, and to treat his mother with such disrespect would be unconscionable, and something Alistair himself would never have condoned." Mr. Harrison's intervention had a visible effect. His status and his known integrity lent weight to his words. The aggressive certainty of Mrs. Beaumont seemed to deflate slightly, replaced by a sullen, watchful resentment. Daniel looked almost relieved that someone else had taken charge, however momentarily. Alara felt a small surge of gratitude towards Mr. Harrison. He had offered her not belief, necessarily, but a chance to be heard with a modicum of fairness, something that was entirely absent until his intervention. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Alara said, her voice regaining its steadiness. "I understand this is shocking. I did not intend to cause such a disruption. My only wish was to honor a promise to Alistair, and to introduce his son to his uncle, as quietly as possible. The circumstances of my reception here have forced my hand." She looked at Daniel, whose eyes were still fixed on Leo. "Daniel," she said gently, "Alistair loved you very much. He wanted you to be a part of Leo's life. He believed you had a good heart." Daniel flinched again at her direct address, at the mention of Alistair's belief in him, a belief he knew, in his heart, he was failing in that very moment. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, cracking sound emerged. The tremors of Alara's revelation continued to ripple through the wedding party. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with shattered assumptions, with the dawning realization that this was no mere social faux pas, but a drama that struck at the very heart of the Ainsworth legacy and the Beaumonts' carefully curated world. The day that was meant to be a celebration of a perfect union had become a crucible, and no one knew what truths or what further devastations would emerge from its fires. Mr. Harrison's calm intervention had an immediate, though temporary, effect. The aggressive, accusatory posture of Mrs. Beaumont faltered slightly, and the chaotic murmuring of the guests subsided into a tense, expectant hush. He wasn't a member of the immediate family, but Charles Harrison was a man whose quiet authority and long association with the Ainsworth legacy commanded respect. He suggested, in a tone that brooked no argument, that this delicate matter be discussed with a little more privacy. A small group, consisting of Alara and Leo, Mrs. Beaumont, Victoria, Daniel, Mr. Harrison himself, and a few other very senior family friends and business associates of the late Alistair, were ushered into a nearby library, a room panelly with dark wood and lined with leather-bound books, a silent testament to generations of Ainsworth history. The atmosphere in the library was thick with unspoken emotions. Mrs. Beaumont, having regained some of her belligerence once out of the immediate public eye, sat stiffly in a large wingback chair, her arms crossed, her face a mask of outrage. Victoria hovered near her mother, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her expression was more one of fury at her ruined wedding day than any genuine sympathy. Daniel stood near the fireplace, pale and agitated, his gaze repeatedly drifting towards young Leo, who clung to Alara's hand, his small face etched with confusion and a dawning awareness that he was at the center of this adult storm. "Miss Vance," Mr. Harrison began, his voice grave but fair, once the door was closed, "you have made an extraordinary claim. As you can imagine, it has caused considerable surprise. You mentioned a promise to Alistair. Perhaps you could elaborate, and if you have any substantiation for your assertion regarding young Leo's paternity, now would be the time to present it." Alara took a calming breath. Her heart was pounding, but the presence of Mr. Harrison and the memory of Alistair's quiet strength gave her courage. She knelt beside Leo for a moment, smoothing his hair. "It's all right, my love," she murmured. "Just stay close to Mama." Then she stood and faced the small, judgmental assembly. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice low but clear. "As I said, I did not come here to cause distress. Alistair and I shared a life together, a private life, for nearly 3 years before Leo was born, and for a year afterwards, until his death. He was a wonderful, loving partner, and a devoted father to our son." "A private life?" Mrs. Beaumont scoffed. "How convenient. So private that no one in his family, no one among his closest friends, ever heard of you or this supposed child." Alistair had his reasons. "Mrs. Beaumont," Alara replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "He was aware of certain familial attitudes, and he wished to protect Leo and me from undue scrutiny and potential unhappiness until he felt the time was right for a formal introduction. A time that, tragically, never came." She reached inside the neckline of her simple dress and drew out the small, antique silver locket Alistair had given her on Leo's first birthday. It was a delicate, unassuming piece, but Alara handled it as if it were a priceless treasure. With trembling fingers, she opened the clasp. "Alistair gave me this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and presented it first to Mr. Harrison. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, were 2 miniature, sepia-toned photographs. One was of a smiling, relaxed Alistair, an Alistair younger and more carefree than most in this room had ever seen him. The other was of Alara, her face soft with love, holding a newborn Leo. Mr. Harrison examined the locket closely, his expression thoughtful. He then passed it to Daniel. As Daniel took the locket, his hand shook. He stared at the tiny images, at his brother's unfamiliar, joyful smile, at the woman his mother had just publicly humiliated, and at the baby who was, unmistakably, a miniature of Alistair. A choked sound escaped him. "Photographs can be faked. Trinkets can be bought. Mrs. Beaumont snapped, though a note of desperation had crept into her voice. Alara ignored her. From her worn handbag, she carefully extracted a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Alistair was not a prolific letter writer, she said, but when he was away on business, or when I had taken Leo to visit my own mother for a few days, he would write. His handwriting was distinctive. She selected one letter and handed it to Mr. Harrison. "Perhaps you would recognize it, sir, and perhaps you, Daniel, would too." The letter, written on Alistair's personal, unadorned stationery, was filled with tender endearments, mundane details of his day, and loving inquiries about our little lion, Alistair's pet name for Leo. It spoke of his impatience to return to them, of his pride in his son's first steps, of his dreams for their quiet future together. It was undeniably Alistair's hand, Alistair's voice, Alistair's heart, laid bare on the page. Daniel read it, his face paling further. He passed it to his new wife, Victoria, whose expression tightened as she scanned the intimate words. Mrs. Beaumont snatched it from her daughter's hand, her eyes devouring the script, searching for any sign of forgery, any hint of deception. But the evidence was there, in the familiar loops and strokes of her son's handwriting. This proves nothing, Griselda insisted. Though her voice lacked its earlier conviction, she could have coerced him. He was always too soft-hearted with certain types of women. There is more. Mrs. Beaumont, Alara said, her calm, unwavering. She did not raise her voice, did not resort to accusations. She simply presented her truth. Alistair had a small, almost invisible scar just above his left eyebrow, from a childhood fall from a tree. He told me the story himself, how Daniel, then just a little boy, had cried more than he had. Daniel looked up sharply, his eyes wide. It was true. He remembered that day vividly. The fear, his older brother's surprising stoicism. It was a small, forgotten detail, something only family, or someone very close, would know. He loved a particular recording of Bach's cello suites, Ilara continued, played by Casals, not the famous studio recording, but a live concert version from the Prades Festival, full of imperfections, but he said it had more soul. He would play it for Leo when he couldn't sleep. She recounted other small, intimate details, his habit of reading the last page of a book first, his secret love for terrible old black-and-white science fiction movies, the way he always hummed slightly off-key when he was concentrating. With each detail, Daniel Ainsworth seemed to shrink a little more, the weight of realization pressing down on him. These were not things a casual acquaintance, an opportunist, could know. This was the fabric of his brother's private life, a life Alistair had evidently shared with this woman and their child. Mr. Harrison, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Eleanor, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I knew Alistair since he was a boy. He was, as Alara described him, a private man. He was also a man of deep integrity and a profound capacity for quiet affection. What Miss Vance describes, it is not inconsistent with the Alistair I knew, the Alistair who often chafed under the more public expectations of his family. He looked at Leo, who was now watching the adults with a child's solemn understanding that something very important was happening, and the boy. Mr. Harrison continued, a softer note in his voice. The resemblance is undeniable. He has Alistair's eyes, Alistair's brow. He is an Ainsworth, through and through. This is a conspiracy, Mrs. Beaumont cried, a last, desperate attempt to deny the undeniable. You are all against me. This woman has fooled you all. There is no conspiracy, Mrs. Beaumont, Ilara said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. Only the truth, a truth Alistair intended to share with his family when he felt the time was right. I am not here to ask for money or to claim a share of the Ainsworth fortune. Alistair, in his quiet way, made sure that Leo and I were provided for through a small, private trust he established, enough for us to live modestly and for Leo to have a good education. His lawyers contacted me after his death regarding its terms. It is entirely separate from his family estate. This new piece of information seemed to stun Mrs. Beaumont into a temporary silence. The primary accusation, that Alara was a gold digger, was effectively neutralized. All I came here for today, all Alistair ever wanted, Alara concluded, her gaze resting on Daniel, was for his son to know his uncle, for Leo to have some connection to his father's family, however small. That was the promise I made to him. That is the only legacy I am here to defend. The fight seemed to drain out of Daniel. He looked at Alara, then at Leo, and a wave of conflicting emotions washed over his face, shock, guilt, and a dawning, painful recognition. He remembered his brother's quiet departures, his unexplained absences, the gentle melancholy that sometimes clung to him. It all made a terrible, heartbreaking kind of sense now. The library was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence. The whispers and tremors of disbelief had given way to the heavy weight of an acknowledged truth, a truth that would change everything for the Ainsworths and the Beaumonts. Alara had presented her case, not with legal arguments or accusations, but with the simple, irrefutable evidence of love, memory, and a child who was the living legacy of a respected man. The defense of that legacy was now complete. The next move belonged to those who had so cruelly misjudged her. The heavy silence in the Beaumont library stretched, taut and brittle. Doña Eleanor Beaumont, for perhaps the first time in her meticulously controlled life, looked utterly undone. The carefully constructed edifice of her social superiority, her unshakable self-assurance, had been demolished by a soft-spoken young woman and a handful of undeniable truths. Her face was a ruin of its former hauteur, her eyes darting about as if seeking an escape route from a reality she could no longer deny or dictate. Victoria, her daughter, the bride whose perfect day had curdled into a public relations nightmare, stood rigidly beside her, her expression a mixture of fury, embarrassment, and a dawning, horrified understanding of the social precipice upon which they now teetered. It was Daniel Ainsworth, the groom, who finally broke the spell. He had been staring at young Leo, at the locket, at the letters, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Now, he slowly raised his head and looked at Alara, not with the flustered awkwardness of before, but with a new, raw vulnerability. "Alistair," he began, his voice hoarse. He never told me about you, about Leo." He gestured vaguely towards the boy, who was watching him with Alistair's solemn gray eyes. "All those times he was away. All those business trips that were so vague. I just assumed." He trailed off, a wave of guilt washing over him. He had been too wrapped up in his own life, his own pursuits, to ever truly question his older brother's carefully guarded privacy. He wanted to. "Daniel," Alara said gently. "He spoke of it often. He was waiting for what he felt was the right moment. He loved you very much. He hoped you and Leo—" She paused, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "He hoped you would be close." Mrs. Beaumont made a strangled sound. "This changes nothing, even if this preposterous story has some grain of truth. It doesn't excuse her behavior. Coming here, empty-handed, causing such a scene at my daughter's wedding." Mr. Harrison, who had been observing the unfolding drama with a statesman's gravitas, cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he said, his tone one of quiet but firm reproof, "I believe the scene, as you call it, was largely of your own making. Miss Vance was subjected to a rather unpleasant and public interrogation regarding her lack of a gift. A gift, I might add, which is meant to be a token of goodwill, not a mandatory entrance fee to a social event." His gaze, though not unkind, was stern. "Alistair Ainsworth was my friend, as he was to many in this room. He was a man of great integrity, but also of deep feeling and a fiercely private nature. Knowing him as I did, Miss Vance's account of their relationship, and of his desire to protect his child from the more challenging aspects of his family's social sphere, rings entirely true." He looked pointedly at Mrs. Beaumont. "Perhaps it is we who owe Miss Vance an apology for the discourtesy she has been shown." The air in the room crackled. For Eleanor Beaumont to apologize was an event rarer than a solar eclipse. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. A battle water raging within her between her ingrained pride and the dawning, terrifying realization of the social fallout this could cause. To have publicly humiliated the mother of Alistair Ainsworth's only son, a son who was now the direct heir to a name and potentially a legacy they all revered. It was a catastrophic misstep. Victoria, ever pragmatic when her own interests were at stake, seemed to grasp this faster than her mother. "Mother," she hissed in a low, urgent whisper. Mr. Harrison is right. This is a delicate situation. We must think of appearances. Daniel, however, seemed less concerned with appearances at that moment and more with the weight of his brother's unspoken trust. He took a tentative step towards Alara and Leo. "Leo," he said, his voice still a little shaky. He knelt, bringing himself to eye level with the small boy. Your father, Alistair. He was a very good man, the best man I knew." He reached out a hesitant hand, and Leo, after a quick glance at Alara for reassurance, shyly placed his small hand in his uncle's. A jolt, almost electric, seemed to pass through Daniel. This was his brother's son, his nephew. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes. "Alara, Miss Vance, I am so sorry for how you've been treated, for my silence. Alistair would be ashamed of me, ashamed of us all." He looked pointedly at his mother-in-law and his new wife. Mrs. Beaumont, seeing the tide irretrievably turned against her, seeing the condemnation in the eyes of Mr. Harrison and the other respected guests who had witnessed her earlier cruelty, finally crumbled. It was not a gracious defeat. There were no tears of remorse, only the hard, dry sob of a thwarted will. "Very well," she managed, her voice tight. "If this child is indeed Alistair's, then things are different." The admission was grudging, forced, but it was an admission nonetheless. Mr. Harrison, sensing the need for a more formal resolution, suggested that he and Licenciado Figueroa, Alistair's personal lawyer whom Alara had mentioned and who had overseen the private trust Alistair had established for Alara and Leo, meet with all parties in the coming days to discuss the formal acknowledgement of Leo and any ensuing implications. Alara agreed calmly. "As I stated, Mr. Harrison, Alistair made provisions for Leo and me. We are not seeking anything further from the Ainsworth estate. My only wish was for Leo to have the possibility of knowing his father's family. Should they prove worthy of that connection, and for Alistair's memory to be honored with truth, not with the indignity we experienced earlier." Her quiet dignity was more powerful than any outburst. The Beaumonts, mother and daughter, looked thoroughly chastened, their earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, uncomfortable silence. The wedding reception, of course, was ruined beyond repair. Most guests, sensing the enormity of the family drama, began to make discreet departures, their minds buzzing with the scandal that would undoubtedly be the talk of their social circles for months to come. In the days that followed, the ripples of that revelation continued to spread. Daniel Ainsworth, to his credit, began to emerge from the shadow of his new in-laws. He insisted on a public apology from the Beaumonts to Alara, which was delivered, albeit stiffly and without genuine warmth from Eleanor Beaumont, in the presence of Mr. Harrison and a few key family members. He also made it clear to Victoria that his relationship with his nephew was non-negotiable. This caused considerable friction in his new marriage. But Daniel, perhaps for the first time in his life, found a strength he didn't know he possessed, a strength drawn from the memory of his brother's integrity. Alara, true to her word, made no claims on the main Ainsworth fortune. The private trust Alistair had established was more than sufficient for her and Leo to live comfortably, and for Leo to have every opportunity in life. She moved out of Clara's small apartment and, with the help of Alistair's lawyer, found a charming little house with a garden in a quiet, unpretentious neighborhood, a place where Leo could play freely and where she could finally begin to heal and build a new life. She allowed Daniel to visit Leo, and slowly, tentatively, a bond began to form between uncle and nephew. Daniel saw so much of Alistair in the boy, his thoughtfulness, his quiet curiosity, his sudden, unexpected flashes of humor. These visits were a bittersweet comfort to Daniel, a way of connecting with the brother he had lost and the nephew he had almost failed. Mrs. Beaumont never truly accepted Alara or Leo. Her pride was too deeply wounded, her nature too ingrained in snobbery and materialism. She maintained a frosty distance, her public image irrevocably tarnished. Victoria, more concerned with salvaging her own social standing, eventually adopted a veneer of polite acceptance towards Leo, though a genuine warmth for Alara never materialized. Their world of superficial judgments had been rocked, but not entirely reformed. But Alara found her own peace, her own richness. It was not the richness of the Beaumonts, built on ostentation and exclusion. It was a richness of love, of integrity, of a life lived with quiet dignity and purpose. She raised Leo with stories of his father, of Alistair's kindness, his intelligence, his belief in doing good in the world. She ensured that Alistair's true legacy, one of love, responsibility, and compassion, lived on in their son. Years later, Alara would sometimes reflect on that disastrous wedding day. The humiliation had been acute, the cruelty almost unbearable. But out of that ugliness, something true and beautiful had been affirmed. She had found her voice, defended her son, and honored the memory of the man she loved. She had learned that a person's worth is not measured by the gifts they bring or the clothes they wear, but by the strength of their character and the truth in their heart. And as she watched young Leo grow, so like his father in spirit and in looks, she knew that Alistair Ainsworth, wherever he was, would be proud. She had kept her promise, and in doing so, she had discovered a different kind of richness, one that no amount of money could ever buy, and no amount of social scorn could ever diminish.